The soft clinking of crystal against porcelain, the low murmur of conversation, the heady aroma of truffle oil, these were the hallmarks of La Mirage, an establishment that prided itself on exclusivity. Charlotte, however, found herself strangely detached from the elegant symphony of the restaurant. She stood just inside the entrance, the heavy oak doors still swinging gently behind her, a small, worn leather purse clutched in her hand. Her simple, navy dress, though impeccably clean and pressed, seemed to pale in comparison to the shimmering gowns and tailored suits that adorned the other patrons. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She'd made the reservation under her husband's name, Carter, a name that usually opened doors both literally and figuratively. She approached the hostess stand, a sleek, polished surface reflecting the ambient light. The hostess, a young woman with impeccably styled blonde hair and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, looked up. Charlotte noticed the swift, almost imperceptible appraisal that swept over her, taking in her attire, her lack of ostentatious jewelry. A flicker of something akin to dismissal registered in the hostess's eyes, so fleeting that Charlotte almost questioned if she'd imagined it. "I have a reservation for two," Charlotte said, her voice quiet but firm. She tried to project an air of calm confidence, despite the subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. She could feel the weight of unseen gazes, the silent judgment of those who seemed to belong in this world of polished surfaces and hushed tones. "Just get through this," she thought to herself. "It's just dinner." "Name?" the hostess asked, her tone clipped. "Carter," Charlotte replied. A brief silence followed, during which the hostess's perfectly manicured fingers tapped on the screen of her reservation system. Charlotte watched, a faint pulse of anxiety beginning to thrum in her chest. This had never happened before. The hostess looked up, a carefully neutral expression on her face. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't seat you." A wave of disbelief washed over Charlotte. Had she heard correctly? In the polished reflection of the hostess stand, she could see her own face, a flicker of confusion clouding her features. "That must be a mistake," she said, forcing a polite smile. "I have a reservation under Carter." She emphasized the name slightly, hoping it would trigger some recognition. The hostess's smile, however, remained fixed. "I'm sorry, but there's no such reservation." She didn't bother to check again. Her gaze shifted past Charlotte, as if searching for the next guest, the next opportunity to perform her carefully choreographed ritual of welcoming the worthy. Charlotte felt a prickle of anger begin to rise within her, a strange mix of humiliation and indignation. It was more than just being denied a table. It was the dismissive tone, the unspoken judgment that hung heavy in the air. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, a mixture of amusement and disdain in their subtle glances. For a brief moment, she considered simply walking away, escaping the suffocating atmosphere of the restaurant. But a stubborn streak of defiance held her rooted to the spot. She wouldn't be dismissed so easily. "Perhaps you could check again," Charlotte persisted, her voice now laced with a hint of steel. "It's under Carter Westwood." The mention of the name seemed to have an effect. The hostess's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She tapped at the screen again, her movements now less assured. A hushed murmur rippled through the small group of patrons waiting nearby. The air crackled with a sudden, palpable tension. "I still can't find it," the hostess stammered, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. She glanced nervously towards the back of the restaurant, as if seeking assistance. Before Charlotte could respond, a deep voice cut through the tense silence. "Is there a problem here?" Charlotte turned and saw her husband, Carter, standing just inside the entrance. His presence filled the space, an aura of quiet authority emanating from him. His eyes, usually warm and gentle, now held a glint of steel. He took in the scene his wife standing alone, the flustered hostess, the curious stares of the other patrons, and his expression hardened. He strode toward Charlotte, his hand reaching out to rest reassuringly on her arm. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. Charlotte opened her mouth to explain, but the hostess, her face now pale, spoke first. "Mr. Westwood, I apologize. There seems to be a mix-up with your reservation." Her voice trembled slightly. Carter's gaze fixed on the hostess, his eyes unwavering. "A mix-up?" he repeated, his tone laced with irony. "Or perhaps something else?" The hostess averted her gaze, her silence speaking volumes. A manager, alerted by the commotion, hurried over, his face a mask of professional concern. He began to apologize profusely, offering excuses and explanations, but Carter cut him short. "I'm not interested in your excuses, Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm interested in understanding why my wife, who had a confirmed reservation, was treated with such disrespect." The manager stammered, unable to meet Carter's gaze. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted dramatically. The murmurs of the other patrons had ceased, replaced by a stunned silence. They watched, captivated, as the scene unfolded. Carter turned to Charlotte, his expression softening. "Let's go, darling," he said, taking her hand. "There are plenty of other restaurants that would be happy to have our business." As they turned to leave, Carter paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the staff and patrons. "And Mr. Calloway," he added, his voice carrying through the hushed restaurant, "I trust you'll be taking appropriate action to ensure this doesn't happen again." The silence that followed their departure was thick with unspoken tension. The hostess and manager stood frozen, their faces reflecting the stark realization of the consequences of their actions. The other patrons, their initial amusement replaced by a mixture of awe and apprehension, watched the door swing shut behind the couple. The air, once filled with the subtle scent of judgment and disdain, now carried the heavy weight of accountability. The crystal chandelier above cast a kaleidoscopic shimmer, fracturing the light into a million glittering shards that danced across the polished marble floor. Charlotte felt the chill of the air conditioning against her skin, a stark contrast to the simmering heat that coiled in her stomach. She had been standing here long enough to observe the precise placement of each orchid in its ornate silver vase, long enough to memorize the pattern of the Persian rug beneath her feet. Each minute that ticked by felt like a small, stinging insect bite, chipping away at her composure. The hostess, perched on her elevated platform like a preening bird, continued to ignore her, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the reservation book as if it held the secrets of the universe. A slow, burning anger, an emotion she rarely allowed herself to indulge, began to creep up Charlotte's spine. It wasn't simply the weight, but the blatant disregard, the palpable disdain radiating from the hostess that made the situation unbearable. A quick glance at the other patrons confirmed her suspicions. Their veiled amusement, the subtle whispers and sideways glances, were like pinpricks, small but cumulatively agonizing. They, too, seemed to find her presence an amusing anomaly, a fly buzzing around a crystal goblet. "Excuse me," Charlotte said again, her voice steadier than she felt. Internally, a small voice whispered warnings, urging her to leave, to avoid the inevitable sting of rejection. But another, fiercer voice insisted she stand her ground. She deserved to be here as much as anyone else. The hostess, without even bothering to meet her gaze, waved a dismissive hand. "Just a moment, madam. I'm attending to other guests." The other guests, Charlotte noted, were a group of impeccably dressed socialites who had just swept in, their laughter echoing through the grand foyer. Charlotte suppressed a sigh. The unspoken message was clear. Her simple elegance, her lack of ostentatious jewelry and designer labels, rendered her invisible. The humiliation, a cold, heavy weight, settled in her chest. She was no stranger to such subtle slights, the unspoken judgments that came with not conforming to the rigid expectations of a certain social stratum. She had learned to navigate these situations with a quiet dignity, a polite but firm assertion of her presence. But tonight, the carefully constructed walls of her composure began to crumble. The simmering anger within her threatened to boil over. She wouldn't be dismissed, not tonight. "I would like to speak to the manager," she said, her voice now edged with steel. The hostess finally looked up, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arching in surprise. "The manager? Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Charlotte met her gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "Yes," she replied simply. "There is." The hostess, with a theatrical sigh, disappeared through a discreet side door. The waiting, the scrutiny of the other patrons continued. Charlotte felt a strange detachment from the scene, as if she were watching it unfold from a distance. The opulent surroundings, the hushed conversations, the clinking of silverware, it all felt surreal. A stage set for a play she hadn't auditioned for. A man in a sharply tailored suit emerged from the side door. Mr. Calloway, the manager, his name tag gleaming under the chandelier's light, approached Charlotte with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He exuded an air of practiced charm, the kind that could smooth ruffled feathers and placate disgruntled patrons, but only those who mattered. "Madam," he began, his voice smooth as velvet, "is there something I can assist you with?" The question hung in the air, laced with an undercurrent of impatience. Charlotte could already sense the dismissal forming on his lips. "I've been waiting for a table for over half an hour," she stated, her voice calm despite the turmoil within. "I was told there were no tables available, yet I've seen several parties seated since I arrived." Mr. Calloway's smile faltered, replaced by a thin, professional veneer. "I assure you, madam, our hostess is highly efficient. If she informed you that there were no tables available, then that is indeed the case. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding." He glanced at her attire, a subtle but unmistakable appraisal. The unspoken message was clear. The misunderstanding, in his eyes, was her presence in his establishment. The heat in Charlotte's stomach intensified, the small, stinging bites of humiliation transforming into a searing burn. "I believe I've made myself clear," she said, her voice now tight with suppressed anger. "I would like a table." Mr. Calloway let out a small, exasperated sigh, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Look, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with a condescending edge. "This is a private establishment. We reserve our tables for clientele who fit the atmosphere." He gestured vaguely around the room, at the impeccably dressed diners, their laughter and conversations a carefully orchestrated symphony of exclusivity. The weight of his words, the blatant confirmation of her suspicions, hit Charlotte with the force of a physical blow. The subtle whispers and glances of the other patrons seemed to amplify in the sudden, suffocating silence that followed. She felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, threatening to consume her. It was in that moment, as she stared into the manager's smug, dismissive face, that the heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open, revealing a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. The heavy oak door swung inward, a momentary eclipse of the opulent chandelier's light. A hush fell over the room, the low hum of conversation dying like a flickering candle flame. Charlotte, her hands still resting on the cool marble of the hostess stand, felt a shift in the air, a tangible change in the atmosphere that preceded his arrival. He stood there, framed in the doorway, a figure of quiet power. Carter Westwood, her husband. The whispers stopped. The sideways glances, the barely concealed amusement at her apparent predicament, vanished. He hadn't called. She hadn't expected him. This small act of defiance, this attempt to reclaim a sliver of her own life by having dinner alone, had been impulsive. And now, a wave of complex emotions washed over her. Relief, yes, but also a strange sense of vulnerability, a feeling of being exposed under this sudden, unexpected spotlight. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted him to see her like this, dismissed and belittled. A flicker of resentment, quickly extinguished by a deeper, more familiar warmth, sparked within her. His gaze swept across the room, a silent acknowledgement of the scene before him. He moved with an unhurried grace, his steps measured, each footfall seeming to absorb the tension that crackled in the air. The hostess, her face now drained of its earlier superciliousness, straightened her posture, a nervous tremor in her hand as she smoothed down her pristine uniform. The manager, Mr. Calloway, who had remained studiously absorbed in polishing a wine glass just moments before, suddenly appeared beside her, his face a mask of strained cordiality. Carter stopped before them, his presence radiating an aura of authority that had nothing to do with raised voices or aggressive gestures. It was in the stillness of his gaze, the subtle set of his jaw, the way he held himself, utterly self-possessed. He didn't need to shout. The silence itself was a command. "Is there a reason my wife has not been seated?" His voice was low, even devoid of any overt anger, yet it carried a weight that settled heavily in the room. Charlotte watched the interplay of expressions on the faces before her. The hostess's carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing a raw fear beneath. Mr. Calloway stammered, a string of apologies and excuses forming and dissolving on his lips. He gestured vaguely towards a non-existent wait list, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control, of professionalism. But the lie was transparent, hanging in the air like the lingering scent of cheap perfume. Carter's gaze remained fixed on the manager, unwavering. He didn't interrupt the man's stumbling explanations, didn't acknowledge the frantic gestures, the increasingly desperate attempts to salvage the situation. He simply waited, his silence more damning than any accusation. He knew exactly what had transpired here. The unspoken knowledge hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Charlotte saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening of his lips. He had seen her humiliation, witnessed the subtle disdain, the barely veiled mockery. And in that moment, she understood. This wasn't just about a table. This was about something more profound, something that touched a raw nerve within him. Mr. Calloway finally trailed off, his voice dissolving into a pathetic whimper. He looked from Carter to Charlotte and back again, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the quiet clinking of silverware from the occupied tables. The other patrons, their initial amusement replaced by a nervous anticipation, watched the scene unfold with a morbid fascination. Carter finally shifted his gaze to the hostess, his expression unreadable. "You judge my wife based on her appearance," he stated, not as a question, but as a simple observation. "You assumed, incorrectly, that she didn't belong here." The hostess, her face now a mask of shame, could only manage a weak nod, her eyes fixed on the floor. The carefully applied makeup couldn't conceal the tremor in her chin. "And you," Carter turned back to Mr. Calloway, his voice hardening slightly, "allowed this to happen. You condone this behavior." Mr. Calloway opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The carefully cultivated image of sophisticated indifference he had so meticulously crafted over the years he shattered into 1,000 pieces. Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his tone, the controlled anger simmering beneath the surface, was far more effective than any outburst. He spoke a few words to the manager, low and precise, outlining the consequences of such discriminatory practices. He spoke of reputation, of integrity, of the fundamental principles of respect and decency. And with each word, Mr. Calloway's face paled further, the sweat beading on his forehead. Charlotte watched, a strange calm settling over her. This wasn't the explosive confrontation she might have expected. This was something else entirely. This was a dismantling, a methodical stripping away of pretense and arrogance. This was justice, served not with fiery rage, but with icy precision. Within minutes, the hostess was dismissed, her hurried departure a blur of humiliation and regret. Mr. Calloway, his career in tatters, followed shortly after, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The hushed whispers of the other diners, now laced with a newfound respect, followed them out the door. Carter turned to Charlotte, his expression softening. He offered his arm, a silent invitation. She took it, her fingers intertwining with his. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. The humiliation, the sting of the initial rejection, faded, replaced by a quiet sense of vindication. She hadn't needed rescuing. He hadn't come to rescue her. He had come to restore balance, to reaffirm her worth, not just to the staff of this pretentious establishment, but to herself. And in that shared understanding, in that silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond between them, lay a strength more potent than any outward display of power. The opulent chandelier cast a shimmering, almost mocking, light across the marble floor. Charlotte felt the chill of it against her skin, a stark contrast to the burning shame creeping up her neck. Her gaze remained fixed on the hostess's name tag, Tiffany, a name that now resonated with a brittle, artificial sweetness. Just moments ago, this woman, with her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a smile as thin as the porcelain plates adorning the nearby tables, had dismissed her with a dismissive flick of her wrist. Charlotte's stomach tightened. The humiliation was a physical ache, a cold knot that seemed to expand with each passing second. She considered leaving, the urge to escape the suffocating scrutiny of the other diners almost overwhelming. But something held her rooted to the spot. A flicker of defiance, perhaps. Or maybe it was simply the exhaustion that came from constantly battling these subtle, insidious judgments. Then, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the hushed murmur of the restaurant. Charlotte, her head snapped up. Carter. He stood at the entrance, a figure of quiet authority in his impeccably tailored suit. The subtle shift in the restaurant's atmosphere was palpable. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the room. Carter's presence commanded attention, not through any ostentatious display, but through the sheer force of his personality. He crossed the room towards her, his gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the hostess's flustered expression, the manager's sudden, nervous interest. Charlotte watched him, a strange mix of relief and apprehension swirling within her. Relief that he was here, apprehension at what might follow. She knew Carter. He wouldn't make a scene, not in the way one might expect. But he also wouldn't let this stand. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice low and even, yet laced with an undercurrent that spoke of steel beneath velvet. Before Charlotte could respond, the manager, a portly man named Calloway, materialized beside them, his face a mask of forced cordiality. "Mr. Westwood, what a pleasant surprise. Is there something I can assist you with?" His words dripped with insincerity, the kind that only comes from years of practiced deference to wealth and power. Carter's gaze, sharp and unwavering, met Calloway's. "My wife was just telling me she couldn't get a table." He paused, the silence hanging heavy in the air. "I find that curious," Calloway stammered, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. "A misunderstanding, I assure you, sir. A temporary lack of availability. We're quite full this evening." He gestured vaguely at the restaurant, which, while busy, clearly had several empty tables. Charlotte saw a flicker of something in Carter's eyes. Not anger, not exactly. Something colder, more calculating. "Is that so?" He turned to the hostess, Tiffany, who stood frozen, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the pallor creeping into her cheeks. "Perhaps you could explain." Tiffany opened her mouth, then closed it again, her eyes darting between Carter and the manager. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. "To thought," she began, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the sudden hush of the restaurant. "You thought," Carter prompted, his voice soft, almost gentle, yet the single word held an undeniable weight. "Misunderstood," she stammered, her carefully constructed composure shattering. "I apologize." Calloway, sensing the shifting tide, interjected, his voice strained. "A simple mistake, Mr. Westwood. We'll, of course, arrange a table for you immediately. The best in the house." Carter's gaze remained fixed on Tiffany. "Perhaps you could enlighten me on your criteria for allocating tables. What led you to believe my wife wouldn't be a suitable patron?" The silence that followed was deafening. The clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, all seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the quiet hum of the chandelier and the frantic thumping of Charlotte's heart. She watched the hostess squirm, the manager sweat, and the other diners, once amused, now watching with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Carter didn't press, didn't raise his voice. He simply waited, the silence itself a potent weapon. Finally, he turned to Calloway. I imagine your investors wouldn't appreciate hearing about this discrimination. Calloway paled visibly. The mention of investors struck a nerve. This wasn't just about a disgruntled customer anymore. This was about reputation, about profit, about the carefully cultivated image of exclusivity that this restaurant traded on. Mr. Westwood, please, Calloway pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. Let me speak to the owner. I'm sure we can resolve this discreetly. Carter nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. Calloway practically scrambled to the back, his phone clutched in his hand. While Calloway was gone, the atmosphere in the restaurant remained tense. Charlotte, still processing the swift turn of events, watched the expressions on the faces around them. The initial amusement had vanished, replaced by a mixture of unease and curiosity. Some avoided her gaze, others stared openly, their expressions now tinged with a hint of awe. Calloway returned, his face ashen. He spoke in hushed tones, his words barely audible above the soft strains of music now filtering through the speakers. The owner, apparently, was not pleased. The hostess was fired, effective immediately. The manager, too, faced disciplinary action. They offered profuse apologies, a complimentary meal, anything to appease Carter and make the incident disappear. Carter listened impassively. He declined the meal, the apologies feeling hollow and insincere. He simply took Charlotte's hand, his touch firm and reassuring. Come, Charlotte, let's find somewhere else to dine. As they turned to leave, Carter paused, his gaze sweeping over the now silent restaurant. He addressed no one in particular, his voice carrying clearly through the room. My wife, by the way, he said, his tone even and measured, is Charlotte Westwood, heiress to the Van der Linde fortune. He paused, letting the words sink in. I trust you'll remember that in the future. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, as they walked out, Charlotte heard the first whispers, the ripples of shock and disbelief spreading through the restaurant like wildfire. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The quiet satisfaction that settled within her was more fulfilling than any apology, any complimentary meal, any forced display of deference. Tonight, she hadn't just secured table. She had reclaimed her dignity. The plush velvet ropes felt strangely cold against Charlotte's hand as she pushed them aside. The same hostess who had dismissed her with a dismissive flick of the wrist now simpered, her face a mask of strained apology. Madam, she began, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that grated on Charlotte's nerves. Mr. Calloway and I would like to offer you our sincerest apologies. We've prepared a table for you, the best in the house. A table draped in crisp white linen, glittering under the crystal chandelier, stood conspicuously empty. It was the very table she had requested earlier. The one the hostess acclaimed was reserved. Charlotte's stomach twisted. This wasn't an apology. It was a performance, a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation now that they knew who she was. She glanced at Carter, his expression unreadable, a shadow of something hard flickering in his eyes. He hadn't spoken a word since his arrival, his mere presence radiating an aura of quiet power that had silenced the bustling restaurant. A part of her, a small, wounded part, wanted to accept the offer, to savor the belated deference. But a stronger part, a part newly awakened by the injustice, refused to be pacified by this hollow gesture. Thank you, Charlotte said, her voice deceptively calm, each word carefully measured. But I have no appetite for food served with a side of humiliation. Madam, please. Mr. Calloway, the manager, wrung his hands, his earlier indifference replaced by a frantic anxiety. We understand your displeasure. Allow us to make amends. His words felt empty, devoid of genuine remorse. He wasn't apologizing for the slight, only for being caught. Charlotte felt a surge of disgust. This man, this restaurant, they didn't care about her feelings. They cared about their image, about the potential damage to their precious reputation. Amends, Charlotte echoed, a faint smile playing on her lips. The smile didn't reach her eyes. Inside, a cold, quiet anger simmered. I think you've already made them. She turned to Carter, a silent question in her gaze. He nodded, a single, almost imperceptible movement. It was enough. "Let's go somewhere where people understand the value of respect," Charlotte said, her voice regaining its usual soft timbre, yet carrying an undercurrent of steel. She tucked her hand in Carter's arm, the warmth of his touch a stark contrast to the chill that had settled over the room. As they turned to leave, Carter paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the restaurant staff. The hostess's carefully constructed composure crumbled under his scrutiny. Mr. Calloway's face was a mask of desperation, his eyes pleading. Carter's voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled, yet it cut through the hushed whispers of the restaurant like a shard of ice. "Mr. Henderson, isn't it?" He addressed a man hovering nervously in the background, a man Charlotte recognized from the restaurant's website as the owner. "Why, yes, Mr. Westwood," the owner stammered, his face pale. The hushed whispers intensified, a ripple of recognition spreading through the room. The patrons, who had earlier watched the scene with amusement, now stared with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "A word," Carter said, his voice unwavering. He steered Mr. Henderson away from the main dining area, towards a secluded corner. Charlotte watched them, her heart pounding against her ribs. The air crackled with unspoken tension. She could only imagine the conversation taking place, the quiet dismantling of reputations, the swift and decisive wielding of power. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence in the restaurant was almost palpable, broken only by the nervous clinking of silverware. When Carter returned, his expression was unchanged, his demeanor calm. He placed a crisp $100 bill on a nearby table. "Consider this my final tip," he said, his voice laced with a chilling politeness, "for your severance." He directed his gaze towards the hostess and Mr. Calloway, their faces draining of all color. Mr. Henderson, his face ashen, approached the pair. The words he spoke were low, but Charlotte heard them clearly. "You're fired. Both of you." The hostess gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Calloway opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. The shock of the dismissal seemed to have paralyzed him. As Carter escorted Charlotte towards the exit, a strange thing happened. A smattering of applause erupted from the dining area, growing louder, more insistent. Charlotte glanced back, surprised. The faces of the patrons, once filled with amusement or indifference, now reflected a different emotion: respect. A small, hesitant smile touched Charlotte's lips. This wasn't the victory she had envisioned, but it was a victory nonetheless. It wasn't about the table, the restaurant, or the misplaced sense of exclusivity. It was about dignity, about being seen, about refusing to be silenced. Outside, the cool night air was a welcome relief. Charlotte took a deep breath, the tension slowly ebbing away. Carter wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, laced with concern. "I am now," she replied, meeting his gaze. In that moment, surrounded by the glittering lights of the city, she felt a profound sense of peace. The humiliation she had felt earlier had been replaced by something stronger, something more resilient. She had been seen, not for the clothes she wore or the car she drove, but for who she was. And that, she realized, was all that truly mattered. The low hum of the limousine's engine was a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions still swirling within Charlotte. The plush leather seats cradled her, a world away from the hard, unforgiving stare she had endured just moments before. She watched the city lights blur past, each streak a fleeting reminder of the humiliation that had burned its way into her memory. She hadn't wanted a grand entrance, hadn't desired to be fawned over. All she had wanted was a quiet dinner. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her husband's wealth, a shield in so many ways, had become the very reason she was judged unworthy. Unworthy of a table, unworthy of common courtesy. The injustice of it gnawed at her, a quiet rage simmering beneath her composed exterior. Beside her, Carter's hand found hers. His touch, firm yet gentle, was a silent reassurance, a wordless apology for the indignity she had suffered. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the controlled fury barely contained beneath his calm facade. He had handled the situation with a chilling grace, his words cutting deeper than any raised voice. The hostess's forced smile, the manager's stammering apologies, they were all etched into Charlotte's mind. Small victories in a battle she hadn't asked to fight. "They'll learn," Carter said, his voice low and resonant, each word carefully chosen. His gaze was fixed on the passing cityscape, yet Charlotte knew he wasn't truly seeing it. He was replaying the scene, dissecting every nuance, every slight. "I never wanted special treatment," Charlotte replied, the words barely a whisper, yet heavy with meaning. She closed her eyes, trying to erase the image of the hostess's disdainful smirk. But sometimes people need a reminder that kindness and respect shouldn't be reserved for the wealthy. The thought echoed in the silence of the limousine, a quiet indictment of a world that often valued appearance over substance. Carter turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "They mistook your quiet dignity for weakness, Charlotte. They underestimated you, and they paid the price." A faint smile played on his lips, a hint of the steel beneath the surface. "I've already instructed my team to publicize the incident. Not for revenge," he added, sensing her hesitation, "but to expose their discriminatory practices. This isn't just about us, Charlotte. It's about everyone who's ever been judged unfairly, dismissed because they didn't fit some arbitrary standard." His words resonated with her, a deep chord of understanding vibrating between them. She had seen it countless times, the subtle snubs, the dismissive glances, the unspoken judgments. It was a silent language spoken in the hallowed halls of privilege, a language she had never learned and never wished to. "It's unsettling," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The thought of the incident becoming public knowledge, of being the center of attention, made her uneasy. She had always preferred the quiet corners of life, the solace of anonymity. Carter squeezed her hand, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I know," he said softly, "but sometimes silence is complicity. We have a platform, Charlotte, a responsibility to use our privilege for good. This isn't about seeking retribution. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what you did tonight." The weight of his words settled upon her, a heavy cloak of responsibility. She had always been content to live a life away from the spotlight, but Carter's words sparked a flicker of understanding within her. Their wealth, their influence, wasn't just about luxury and comfort. It was a tool, a weapon against injustice, a shield for those who had none. The limousine glided smoothly through the city streets, a sanctuary of quiet amidst the urban clamor. Charlotte leaned back against the plush leather, her mind replaying the events of the evening. The sting of humiliation was still present, a dull ache in her chest, but it was now overshadowed by a quiet sense of vindication. She had been judged, dismissed, and underestimated. Yet, in the end, it was the hostess, the manager, and the restaurant's reputation that had been tarnished. Carter's actions weren't about revenge. They were about justice. A quiet, understated justice that resonated with a power far greater than any outburst of anger. It was a lesson delivered not with a shout, but with a whisper, a lesson that would hopefully ripple outwards, touching those who had witnessed the scene and beyond. The car pulled up to their residence, a beacon of warmth and security against the backdrop of the night. As they stepped out, Charlotte paused, looking back at the receding city lights. The incident at the restaurant had been a stark reminder of the invisible walls that divided people, the judgments that were passed based on superficial appearances. But it had also been a testament to the power of quiet dignity, the strength that came from knowing one's own worth, regardless of what others might think. It was a lesson she wouldn't soon forget, a lesson etched not in anger, but in the quiet resolve that now settled within her. In the grand tapestry of life, everyone deserved respect, not because of their wealth or status, but simply because they were human. This fundamental truth, often obscured by the glitter of wealth and the allure of power, had been brought into sharp focus tonight. And in the quiet of the night, as the city slept, Charlotte knew that the ripples of this single incident would continue to spread, carrying with them a powerful message of equality, respect, and the inherent worth of every individual.